December 11th, 1941, Berlin, Reich Chancellery. Adolf Hitler stood before the Reichstag in the Kroll Opera House, one hand gripping the podium while the other gestured with theatrical precision, his voice rising in manufactured indignation as he declared war on the United States of America. The chamber reeked of cigar smoke, and wool uniforms dampened by winter sleet tracked in from the streets outside. 4 days had passed since Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, and Hitler, bound by the Tripartite Pact, but more fundamentally driven by his contempt for what he perceived as mongrel American democracy, chose this moment to transform a Pacific conflict into a truly global war. Around him, Nazi officials and military commanders rose in orchestrated ovation, but several faces in that crowd, those who had studied intelligence reports, who had toured American factories before the war, who understood manufacturing capacity in concrete rather than ideological terms, remained conspicuously subdued. Among them was Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and soon-to-be armaments minister, who would later recall feeling a cold dread during that speech, understanding with engineering precision what Hitler either could not grasp or willfully ignored, that declaring war on the United States meant competing against an industrial system so vast, so productive, so fundamentally different in scale and organization from anything in European experience that victory was not merely difficult, but mathematically impossible. The Americans, Speer knew from pre-war visits, did not simply build more. They had created an entirely different philosophy of production, where abundance was assumed, where standardization and mass manufacturing had been refined to levels that European craft-based industry could not match, where a single automotive plant in Detroit could outproduce entire sectors of German manufacturing. As Hitler's voice echoed through the chamber with declarations about German superiority and American weakness, Speer was already calculating tonnages, production rates, and resource flows, and the numbers told a story that ideology could not refute. Germany had just made an enemy of the world's industrial superpower, and that decision would determine the war's outcome more certainly than any battlefield victory or tactical brilliance. The story of what Axis leaders said when they realized America's industrial might is fundamentally a chronicle of ideological blindness confronting mathematical reality, of military prowess rendered irrelevant by manufacturing capacity, of the moment when Germany, Japan, and Italy understood, too late to reverse course, that they had entered a war of production they could not possibly win. American industrial power in 1941 was already formidable, but operating at peacetime capacity, producing automobiles, refrigerators, and consumer goods in quantities that seemed almost wasteful to European observers accustomed to scarcity and rationing. When that capacity was redirected toward military production, the transformation was so rapid and comprehensive that even Allied leaders were astonished. Between 1940 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, over 86,000 tanks, 265,000 artillery pieces, and 5,000 cargo ships, more military equipment than all other combatant nations combined. The Liberty Ship program alone, which mass-produced 10,000-ton cargo vessels using assembly line techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing, built ships faster than German U-boats could sink them, averaging 3 ships per day at peak production. Henry Kaiser's shipyards reduced construction time from months to weeks, eventually setting a record by completing one Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, in 4 days and 15 hours from keel laying to launch. This was not merely quantitative advantage, but qualitative transformation. American industry had industrialized warfare itself, applying the principles of standardization, interchangeable parts, and mass production that Henry Ford had pioneered to the manufacture of weapons and vehicles at scales that rendered traditional European military production obsolete. The Axis leaders had expected many things when they calculated their strategic positions in 1941. They expected that American industrial power would eventually become a factor, but they gambled on winning decisive victories before that power could be mobilized and deployed. They expected that geographic distance would delay American intervention long enough for Germany to consolidate control over Europe and Japan to establish its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. They expected that American society, which they perceived as soft, materialistic, and divided, would lack the will to sustain a long war of attrition once casualties mounted. What they did not expect, what their ideological frameworks prevented them from understanding, was the speed and totality with which American industry could convert to war production, the efficiency with which a democratic society could organize national mobilization, and most fundamentally, the degree to which industrial abundance would translate directly into military dominance. Hitler's racial theories led him to dismiss American combat effectiveness as the product of a mongrel population incapable of German discipline. Japanese military planners, steeped in Bushido tradition that valued spirit over material, convinced themselves that superior morale and tactical skill would overcome American numerical advantages. Italian fascists, despite Mussolini's early recognition of American productive capacity, believed that ancient Roman virtues reborn would triumph over materialistic Anglo-American plutocracy. These were not merely propaganda slogans, but genuine beliefs held by military and political leaders who made strategic decisions based on fundamentally flawed assessments of what determined modern warfare's outcomes. The intelligence reports reaching Axis capitals told a different story, but they were systematically dismissed or reinterpreted through ideological filters. German military intelligence had documented American production capacity before the war. The Abwehr maintained detailed files on American factories, steel mills, and automotive plants. Japanese naval attachés had toured American shipyards and aircraft factories, filing reports that emphasized American industrial supremacy. But when these reports contradicted ideological certainties or strategic necessities, they were ignored. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, had calculated that sinking 800,000 tons of Allied shipping per month would strangle Britain's supply lines and force capitulation. He achieved those numbers briefly in early 1942, but even as German submarines sent tankers and freighters to the Atlantic floor, American shipyards were producing replacements faster than they could be sunk. By late 1943, Dönitz was reporting to Hitler that the tonnage war was lost, that Allied construction had not only replaced losses, but exceeded them, that the convoy system now had enough escorts equipped with improved radar and sonar, that U-boat losses were becoming unsustainable. Hitler's response, according to Dönitz's memoirs, was to rage against defeatism and order continued attacks regardless of cost. The mathematical reality that American industrial capacity had fundamentally altered the strategic equation was politically unacceptable and therefore rejected. The symbolic object that came to represent American industrial might in Axis consciousness was, ironically, one of the least martial: the Jeep. The quarter-ton four-wheel drive utility vehicle that Willis Overland and Ford produced by the hundreds of thousands became ubiquitous across every theater of war where American forces operated. German and Japanese soldiers encountered Jeeps everywhere, towing artillery, carrying supplies, evacuating wounded, serving as command vehicles, reconnaissance platforms, even makeshift ambulances. What made the Jeep symbolically powerful was not its technical sophistication, which was minimal, but its sheer abundance and versatility. It represented an approach to logistics and mobility that Axis forces, chronically short of vehicles and fuel, could not match. German infantry divisions relied heavily on horse-drawn transport. The Wehrmacht employed over 2.5 million horses during the war, while American divisions were fully motorized. A captured German operations officer, interrogated after the Battle of the Bulge, reportedly told his questioners that the decisive weapon was not your tanks or artillery, but your trucks. We could destroy your armor, but you simply brought more, faster than we could replace our losses. Your mobility was overwhelming. Japanese forces in the Pacific encountered similar disparity. American units moved with mechanical transport, while Japanese soldiers, cut off from resupply, trudged through jungles half-starved. Their logistics collapsed. The Jeep became shorthand in Axis military communications for American material superiority. To report roads full of Jeeps was to convey not just enemy presence but logistical dominance, to acknowledge that the Americans could sustain operations that Axis forces could only dream of mounting. Albert Speer's transformation from architectural confidant to armaments minister in February 1942 coincided with his growing understanding that Germany was in an unwinnable production competition. Speer brought technocratic rationality to German war economy, streamlining production, reducing bureaucratic interference, implementing mass production techniques borrowed explicitly from American practices. Under his management, German armaments production increased dramatically. Tank production tripled between 1942 and 1944. Aircraft production doubled. Yet even these impressive gains only highlighted the futility of competing with American capacity. Speer later wrote that in 1943, when German aircraft production reached its wartime peak of approximately 25,000 planes, he learned that American factories had produced over 85,000 aircraft that same year. The comparison was so devastating, Speer recalled in his memoirs, that I initially believed the intelligence report must be in error by a factor of 10. When I confirmed the figures through multiple sources, I understood with absolute clarity that we had lost the war. Not lost in the sense of battlefield defeats from which one might recover, but lost structurally, mathematically, irreversibly. We were fighting with a pistol against a machine gun, and the machine gun had unlimited ammunition. The transformation in Axis military doctrine during the war's latter years reflected desperate adaptation to industrial realities that could no longer be denied. By 1944, German tactical manuals, once emphasizing rapid mechanized warfare and decisive maneuver, had been rewritten to focus on defensive operations, fighting withdrawals, and economy of force. Japanese military planning shifted from offensive operations to honorable death strategies, designed less to achieve victory than to inflict maximum casualties in hopes of breaking American will. These doctrinal changes acknowledged without explicitly stating that material inferiority had become so severe that conventional military success was impossible. German officers returning from the Eastern and Western fronts brought consistent reports. Soviet forces were now fully mechanized with American trucks. Their logistics had transformed from the desperate improvisation of 1941-42 into smoothly functioning supply systems. American and British forces in the West attacked with artillery concentrations that German doctrine assumed required weeks of ammunition accumulation, but which Allied logistics sustained continuously. The Wehrmacht's final offensives, the Ardennes in the West, the Lake Balaton offensive in Hungary, were predicated not on achieving sustainable breakthroughs, but on capturing Allied fuel dumps because German forces literally could not carry sufficient fuel to sustain operations beyond their start lines. The psychological impact on Axis soldiers of confronting this material disparity has been documented extensively in post-war oral histories and contemporary letters that evaded military censorship. A Luftwaffe pilot's letter, intercepted by Allied intelligence in 1944, described the surreal experience of attacking American bomber formations. "We shoot down 10, 20, sometimes 30 of their aircraft in a single engagement, and the next day they return with even more. We lose 3 or 4 pilots, irreplaceable men with years of experience, and achieve nothing strategic. They lose more aircraft, but they are back the next morning with replacement planes and fresh crews. It is not warfare, it is industrial attrition, and we are being ground to dust." German tank commanders expressed similar sentiments. Otto Carius, one of Germany's most successful tank aces, wrote in his memoirs of the growing futility of tactical excellence. "We could destroy 5 Sherman tanks for every Tiger lost, but they had 50 Shermans for every Tiger we fielded. Mathematics rendered courage irrelevant." Japanese veterans of the Philippines campaign described watching American supply convoys stretching to the horizon, ships unloading trucks that drove inland delivering artillery shells, food, fuel, ammunition in quantities that seemed impossible. One Japanese officer, captured on Luzon, told his interrogators that American firepower made traditional infantry tactics suicidal. "Your artillery fired for 3 hours before your infantry advanced. 3 hours of continuous shelling that destroyed every defensive position. We had perhaps 20 shells per gun remaining. You could afford to fire 3 hours of preparatory bombardment for a minor attack. That difference was the war." The strategic bombing campaigns, Allied air forces methodically destroying German and Japanese industrial capacity, represented industrial warfare's purest expression. American and British bomber fleets numbering thousands of aircraft could absorb horrific losses and continue operations because replacement aircraft and crews arrived faster than attrition removed them. The 8th Air Force, operating from Britain against German targets, lost over 26,000 aircraft during the war, more than the entire Luftwaffe possessed at any single time, yet continued expanding throughout the conflict. German industrial production, despite Speer's organizational improvements, steadily declined under sustained bombardment, not because any single raid was decisive, but because cumulative damage exceeded repair capacity. Ball-bearing factories, synthetic fuel plants, rail marshalling yards, and oil refineries were struck repeatedly. Even when attacks failed to destroy targets completely, the constant disruption degraded production efficiency. By 1945, German factories that remained physically intact sat idle for lack of electrical power, raw materials, or transportation to move finished goods. Japanese industry faced similar systematic destruction. American B-29 Superfortress bombers, operating from bases in the Marianas, conducted incendiary raids against Japanese cities built largely of wood and paper, creating firestorms that killed tens of thousands per raid. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan culminated in attacks so devastating that Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding the bomber offensive, later acknowledged he would have been tried as a war criminal had America lost. Yet the attacks continued because American industrial capacity made them possible, and military logic deemed them effective in hastening surrender. The contrast between American and Axis industrial philosophies extended beyond mere production numbers to fundamental approaches to manufacturing and logistics. American industry embraced standardization and interchangeable parts, the principle that any component from any factory would fit any vehicle or weapon of that type. This enabled rapid field repair and simplified supply chains. German and Japanese industry, by contrast, maintained craft traditions where components often required fitting and finishing by skilled workers, making field repair difficult and supply logistics nightmarishly complex. A Sherman tank's engine could be replaced in a few hours by ordinary mechanics using standard tools and a replacement engine from any American depot. A Panther tank's engine required specialized tools, skilled technicians, and often factory-specific components. The Sherman was mechanically simpler and less capable in direct combat, but it was reliable and maintainable under field conditions. The Panther was technically superior, but broke down frequently and spent more time under repair than in combat. American military planners accepted that individual weapon systems might be inferior to Axis equivalents if American systems could be produced in overwhelming numbers and kept operational through superior logistics. This was not technological deficiency, but philosophical choice. Better to field 10 adequate tanks that worked than 3 superior tanks frequently broken. The economic mobilization that enabled American industrial dominance was itself remarkable for how completely it transformed society without destroying democratic institutions. Britain had mobilized earlier and more thoroughly than the United States in proportional terms, but Britain was also smaller and more vulnerable, necessitating state control and rationing that approached total war socialism. The Soviet Union's mobilization was even more extreme, with Stalin's command economy directing resources with brutal efficiency at enormous human cost. Germany and Japan militarized their economies early, with state direction and totalitarian control over labor and resources. The United States, by contrast, achieved industrial mobilization largely through market mechanisms supplemented by government contracts and coordination. American factories converted to war production not primarily through state seizure, but through lucrative contracts that made military manufacturing profitable. Workers moved to war industries attracted by high wages in what became a seller's market for labor. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, the famous Rosie the Riveter representing millions of real women working in factories, shipyards, and aircraft plants, not through conscription, but through economic opportunity and patriotic appeal. This market-based mobilization proved remarkably efficient, producing innovation and productivity gains that state-directed economies struggled to match. American industry not only built weapons but continuously improved them, incorporating combat feedback into revised designs that were in production within months. The financial capacity supporting American industrial production was equally important and equally unmatched by Axis powers. The United States financed its war effort through deficit spending, war bonds, and an expanding economy that grew even as it shifted to military production. American GDP increased by over 50% between 1941 and 1945, a staggering achievement that meant the nation could afford massive military spending while maintaining civilian living standards higher than other combatants' peacetime norms. Germany and Japan, by contrast, financed their wars through plunder, confiscation, and slave labor, methods that provided immediate resources but destroyed long-term productive capacity. German occupation policies in Eastern Europe prioritized extraction over sustainability, leading to resistance, sabotage, and eventual collapse. Japanese exploitation of conquered territories in Asia alienated populations and provoked guerrilla warfare that required garrison forces that could have been deployed elsewhere. American Lend-Lease aid to Britain and the Soviet Union, over $50 billion in material delivered during the war, represented a level of generosity possible only for a nation whose industrial surplus exceeded domestic military requirements. Stalin famously acknowledged in private that the Soviet Union could not have withstood German invasion without American trucks, food, and raw materials, even while Soviet propaganda minimized Western contributions. The cultural dimension of this industrial competition manifested in morale and expectations. American soldiers, even when facing hardship in combat, could expect regular resupply, mail from home, occasional hot meals, and medical care that returned wounded men to full health at rates unimaginable to Axis forces. German and Japanese soldiers grew accustomed to deprivation, inadequate rations, ammunition shortages, lack of reinforcements, minimal medical support. Letters from German soldiers on the Eastern Front after 1943 frequently mentioned envy of Soviet logistics. The Russians are now better supplied than we are. They have American trucks and canned meat while we forage for food and walk because we have no fuel for our vehicles. This reversal, where Soviet forces associated in German propaganda with Asiatic backwardness had superior material support than the Wehrmacht, was psychologically devastating for German troops who had believed in their technological and organizational superiority. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific experienced even more severe deprivation. Entire garrisons were reduced to starvation as American submarines and aircraft severed supply lines. When Japanese positions were finally overrun, American forces routinely found enemy dead from malnutrition and disease alongside combat casualties, evidence that Japan could no longer support forces it had deployed. The nuclear weapons that ended the Pacific War represented industrial might's ultimate expression, not primarily because of their destructive power, though that was unprecedented, but because of the industrial and scientific mobilization their development required. The Manhattan Project was simultaneously the most expensive single weapons program in history and a relatively minor portion of total American war expenditure. The project required uranium enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge that consumed 1/7 of all American electrical generation at peak operation. Plutonium production reactors at Hanford occupying hundreds of square miles, and theoretical and experimental work at Los Alamos employing the world's greatest concentration of scientific genius. Germany had explored atomic weapons theoretically, but German scientists concluded that building atomic bombs would require industrial resources Germany could not spare while fighting a multi-front war. Japan's nuclear research never progressed beyond preliminary studies for the same reason: lack of industrial capacity and electrical power. Werner Heisenberg, Germany's leading nuclear physicist, was captured by Allied forces and interned with other German scientists at Farm Hall in England, where their conversations were secretly recorded. When news of Hiroshima reached them in August 1945, the recordings captured Heisenberg's initial disbelief, followed by rapid calculations confirming that the Americans had indeed built and used an atomic bomb. His reaction, shared by his colleagues, was complex. Scientific admiration for the achievement, shock at its destructive use, but underneath, a kind of resigned acknowledgement that, of course, the Americans had succeeded where Germany failed. They had the resources, the industrial base, the scientific personnel, and the time.